So welcome back, students. In the last class, we did discuss about the effects of a tax or the effects of taxation, and we did learn that through that point, we did learn that a tax do really influence or do really affects the various uh, important areas in a country or an economy, which means talking about taxation, it did affects the volume of production. It did affects the level of distribution. It did affects the level of consumption of the people. It did affects the ability to save, the ability to work, so on and so forth. But now let us pick up another term, yes, something to do with taxation, which is known as the incidence of taxation. So, based on the writing that I've sent it to you, here, whenever we talk about the instance of taxation, that means we're talking about the money burden of a tax. It did relates to the final resting place of a tax. Students, if you did recall, while we're still having our regular classes, we did had a discussion on the different types of tax, and one of them it is the differences between a direct tax and an indirect tax. And yes, talking about an indirect tax, here an indirect tax, it is a tax in which the money burden can be shifted from one person to another person. And if you did recall, I did give you an example. Like, suppose we're talking about a particular producer who is producing or supplying or selling a marker. Okay. Suppose at one point of time, I did go and buy one marker from one shop at a rate of say 20 rupees. Okay. But later, what happened was the government imposed a tax on that particular good on that seller. Okay. So what happened was what that seller do after being taxed, he will raise the price of his good. Okay, say might be 2 or 3 rupees. What happened was earlier the cost of that marker it was say 20 rupees, but later due to the tax, okay, its price increases say to 22 or 23 rupees. Okay, and later what I find out is that later my marker got finished, and so again I did go back to the same shop again, buy the same brand, the same quality from that very shop. But only the only thing is that the price had increased. Earlier it was 20, but now it was say 23 rupees, just suppose. Okay, and when I inquired about that increase in price, he just says like, no, it's due to the increase in price. He didn't mention that because of the tax, but because of the increase is just 1 or 2 rupee, I don't bother. Okay, so I just pay and went away. So if you look at that particular situation, yes, initially it seems as if the seller he pay a tax, but in the end he did transfer the burden of that tax from himself to us consumer. Okay, so whatever burden the seller bear at the initial stage, that is referred to as the impact of a tax. And whatever we as consumers bear the burden finally or in the end after paying the price, okay, that is referred to as the incidence of a tax. So the incidence here of a tax, it refers to the ultimate burden of a tax. Okay, if we go back to that very example, when the second time I go to buy that marker, I do pay the extra increase in price, might be the 22 or the 23, whatever. Okay, as for me, I just take it is due to the increase in price, but actually it is the tax that I pay. Okay, so which means I myself, I bear the burden of the tax without knowing it. Okay, so that burden that I bear, that I pay in the end, that is referred to as the incidence of taxation. So if we talk about the incidence of a tax, which is the ultimate burden of a tax, it depends on a number of factors. One of the important factor is that it depends on the elasticity of the good demanded or supplied. Here it says that if the demand for a tax commodity is said to be elastic, here the incidence will be shifted to the producer. But on the other hand, if the demand for such tax commodities is considered to be inelastic, the incidence will be borne by the consumer. Like what the case that I've been given you as an example for buying a marker. On the other hand, talking about the supply, if the supply of the tax commodity is elastic, the incidence will have to be borne by the purchaser or the consumer. And in the other hand, if in the case of inelastic supply of the tax commodity, the incidence will be on the producer himself. So yes, the elasticity do play a very important part uh, in which the incidence of a tax depends. And another important factor that do influence the incidence of a tax, it is the price. Here, the shifting of the tax burden only takes place through a change in price. Okay, again, initially go back to the earlier example that I gave you. Okay, initially say I pay the price, I go to a shop and bought a pen at a price of 10 rupees. But later, after 1 week, okay, I again go to the same shop. What happened is the price increases from 10, say, to 12 rupees. Okay, so what happened was uh, this increase in the price is due to the shifting of the tax burden. Initially, without the tax, it's 10 rupees, but after the tax, the burden did shift from the producer or seller to the consumer. Okay, but on the other hand, if if there is no changes in the price, that means the price remain as it is with the inclusion of the tax. Okay, that means there will be no shifting, no changes in the burden from person to person. That means there the the incidence is being borne only by the producer or by the seller. Another important factor, talking about the tax incidence, it is the time constraint. Okay, what we learn is that in the short run or in the short period, the producer does not have enough time to make adjustment in plant or equipments. Okay, so if demand falls due to due to the increase in price, due to the inclusion of a tax, what happened was he himself have to bear the tax. Okay, he himself have to bear the incidence of the tax. He has to bear the incidence because he cannot, in a short period or in the short run, he cannot reduce the supply or changes the volume of his output. Whereas in the short run, this shifting in the burden can so well be adjusted because it's quite a long time and the adjustment can be made and the incidence can be easily shifted to the side of the consumer. Here another important factor that influence the instance of a tax, it is something to do with the cost or the volume. As we know, like the tax raises the price, and with the increase in the price, what happened was there will be a reduction in demand. And that, however, due to a reduction in demand, there will be also a fall or a reduction in the level of output. But that also, it depends on a particular situation at the time, uh, the situation of the industry or the situation of the firm at a particular point or at a particular time, whether it's experiencing a point of increasing return or increasing cost, or whether it is experiencing a case of decreasing return or cost, etc. Here, if the industry is it's subject to the situation of decreasing cost, okay, a reduction in the level of output will definitely raise the cost, that means the price, and hence there will be, due to the increase in the level of price, there will be a shifting of the burden of the tax. That means there will be the incidence of the tax will be shifted to the consumers. Another important factor is it is something to do with the market type or the market form. What we can see, like under perfect competition, yes, what we learn or what we know is that each firm or each seller do not have a control, do not have yes, absolute control over the price. Therefore, this shifting of the tax burden or the incidence of a tax is impossible under such a market form. Whereas under a monopoly, the producer has absolute control over the price. Okay, and so what happened was, due to the inclusion of the tax, he can definitely increase the price of his good or his commodity, and in doing so he can easily shift the burden from himself to the consumer, and as such the incidence can easily fall under the consumers or the people. So these are some of the factors that do influence the incidence of a tax.